All right, it is Thursday, January 14th, 2021, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and today we're going to cover the UFC's response to the MMA Fighting.com piece regarding Spencer Fisher and the CTE allegations and what the UFC is doing in regards to CTE moving forward for fighters. We'll talk about LFA distancing themselves from UFC Hall of Famer Pat Miletich, who's commentated for them before and who's currently on suspension, and why they're doing that as a business given his recent participation in events that took place at the U.S. Capitol. We'll talk Dana White's crackdown on piracy, specifically what the promotion is doing to curb piracy moving forward, some things that have been going on in the background in terms of them pursuing people that have illegally streamed either pay-per-views or other UFC content. We'll talk about motions filed in the UFC antitrust lawsuit case. We've had a couple of big motions filed in that case from Bellator, the UFC, and some journalists in terms of unsealing certain documents that Judge Boulware has decided he is really likely to do at this point, but we'll dive a little bit more into that. And finally, we're going to do the UFC 257 pay-per-view buy rate predictions. That event taking place 10 days from now. I'll give you an idea of what I think based on previous Conor McGregor pay-per-views and the current climate, how much that can probably bring in pay-per-view buy rate wise. So if you'd like, the timestamps are over here. This time I got it right over here, and they're not clickable. I do apologize. Last week I did say that you could click on those links. You can't, but the timestamps are right over there for anyone that wants to jump into a particular subject. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Anchor FM, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, what have you, the timestamps are also in the description, so you can go ahead and jump ahead if you wish to get right into a particular subject. Again, thanks everybody for joining me. Thank you for listening, watching. We really appreciate it. And let's go ahead and dive in. So the first thing I want to dive into today is the powerful article released over MMAfighting.com by Stephen Morocco in regards to Spencer the King Fisher. So for those of you that don't know who Spencer Fisher is, some of you hardcores will recognize him. People that have been watching since back in the day will recognize him from the old UFC days. He was a fighter that was very well liked, was close, was kind of the perennial contender, close to a title shot, never really got it, but was right there, would always be down to scrap. He had an amazing fight with Matt Wiman. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you go check it out. He's had several amazing fights, was a favorite of Dana White throughout the organization, many times was praised by Dana White. And he retired around 7 years ago due to a brain-related illness, and really what that ended up being was CTE. And this piece by Stephen Morocco, which again is a brilliant piece, if you haven't read it, I recommend you stop the podcast right now, go check it out, and then come back to this, because it's very powerful. Details, the life inside of the Miletich fighting systems gym, which is just crazy what they used to do to guys back there. It details his relationship with Dana White, what happened when Endeavor bought the promotion, how they're getting by, what they're doing, all of this stuff. Great piece, but it takes a look at CTE and it gives a story from a fighter's perspective, from someone who's suffering from it. It gives that perspective of, this is how the promotion treated me. This is something guys should be aware of going into the sport. If you followed boxing, if you followed football, even, right? Concussion, the movie with Will Smith, in regards to the NFL, the CTE is a problem in sports where you have constant head trauma. It's particularly bad in football because, especially linemen, right? You're going, stepping right on each other, and constantly banging into each other almost every play. If you're an offensive lineman, it's bad amongst boxers who have been hit in the head a lot. And you can see signs of it. And there have been MMA fighters who have experienced this before too. Gary Goodridge, there's a great video piece on how he's living his life in terms of dealing with CTE and trying to function. This is another example of that. And when asked about this, Dana White responded saying that, this is part of the gig, that as an amateur boxer himself, he's had to deal with some of those issues. And this is really, part of the territory. And the UFC did announce last week that they've committed, I believe, $1 million to the Cleveland Clinic in terms of furthering research And Dana did elaborate on that as well. I believe I have the quote here. He says, listen, we're all learning every day about this brain injury stuff. We've been investing in this Lou Ruvo Center and this Cleveland Clinic thing to try to figure out more. We're now interested about this thing just came out on Real Sports about psychedelics. We've actually reached out to the John Hopkins guys and we're diving into that. And that is a quote taken from the interview with MMA Junkie. And really, that's, him saying, yes, we're looking into this. Yes, we're investing money in this. It's trying to paint the picture of, hey, the UFC is being proactive about this. But at the same time saying, yes, this is part of the territory. This is a natural thing. The reason he is framing it that way is because if you haven't followed what happened with the NFL and the lawsuits that came out of there, and the scandal is a harsh word, but the kind of in terms of the way they were, at first really trying to quell any information about CTE or head trauma, and concussion again gives a dramatized version of what happened. But you had a doctor who was finding this and saying this is happening in your sport, and the commissioner at the time again was saying, I don't know about all that, all these different things. This is kind of Dana's way of, as a promotion and as a business, and really the leader in MMA in terms of, the flagship promotion of MMA, saying, yeah, this is normal, and trying to normalize it, because that's what he has to do. Because otherwise, if he says, yeah, this is a real problem, yes, this really affects fighters, we need to find out more about it, we need to do these things and really dive into research, this is a huge problem, that starts to open up the door to lots of lawsuits from current and former fighters, right? When you're a business and you're dealing with this type of thing, you have to spin it in one of two ways. A positive light, you have to say, you know what, it's not that bad. All this data on CTE is terrible. Nah, it's fine. It's great. It's good for you, which they can't do with CTE, right? Because that's just not doable. Or you spin it as normal. You normalize it as much as possible. You say, oh, yes, we're aware of it. It sucks. It's terrible, but it's part of everyday life. It's part of everyday life when you're a fighter. Everybody goes through this. This is something you can't avoid. It's, everybody knew that this was a thing. Everybody knew that this is a risk. So we're not liable. This is a normal thing. You want to get in there and fight. It's just like all the other risks of fighting, right? It's same type of deal. It's, this is a normal part of fighting, and that's a risk. And that's how they're spinning this. And, the fact that they are investing any money at all in terms of the research there is a good sign. I think the more research that is done on this is very beneficial to the fighters. And the more we find out about the exact causes and effects and what triggers this, the better, in terms of working for therapeutics for people like Spencer Fisher and Gary Goodridge, who have gone through this and it's really upended their life and caused so much pain. I think the more research you can do into this stuff, the better, if anything, just to help figure out the exact triggers, the exact causes, and look at therapeutics, ideally one day a cure, right? Or a way of stopping it and allowing fights to go on, but doing something to help these guys, because this wasn't known, at least in Gary Goodridge's case, Spencer Fisher's case, this wasn't a thing when they signed up, right? If you're a fighter, yes, you expect to break your bones, you expect to get hit in the head, deal with some stuff, but CTE was not out there. It's a pretty recent thing. And now you've got a lifelong condition that you have to, take medications for to try and deal with it. But it's a chronic lifelong illness. And it's something where in that piece in MMAfighting.com, Spencer Fisher says, that he really hesitates looking at either sparring with guys or having guys hit each other hard or anything of that thing in the dojo that he runs, because he knows the effects firsthand. He's been in some wars. He's taken a lot of hits to the head. He's put on some great fights, but he's taken a lot of hits to the head. And remember, he's from an older era. So, even in today's era, you can have fighters who were maybe making good money and then retired and it dried up. But in, his case, it's definitely dried up. And it's very clear in terms of, what's told in that story, that the money dried up quickly. And it gets into this gray area of what does the promotion owe fighters from a medical standpoint, whether that's, some type of pension, some type of medical payment and insurance, paying for medications. What does the promotion owe these guys versus what's their own risk? And of course, and really just, pitfalls of the job, so to speak. And of course, the UFC is going to position this as this is normal. This is part of the territory that you knew coming in. Something like this could happen. We're sorry. It sucks. We're going to invest money into research, but we're not going to pay for your medications for life. Or we're not going to give you a stipend or pension that will give you so much money every month to help with this stuff. And keep in mind, it came out in that story that until Endeavor bought the UFC, the UFC was paying Fisher, I think it was about $5,000 a month, was just giving him $5,000 a month to sit on the sidelines, similar to what they'd done with Legends contracts, right? With Chuck Liddell, Matt Hughes, those type of things, not to that grand scale, but they were giving him $5,000 a month. And that really helped him. So it gets into this weird area where Dana has to say these things. I don't know whether he believes that, yes, he really thinks they're trying to look into this stuff and he's really gung-ho on all of this. Whether he believes, yes, this is part of the gig and you should have known that coming in, so to speak, and everybody's dealing with it. And I feel for you, but, this is just normal. I can't know how much of that is truly Dana's words versus the PR side to it, because he has to tread very carefully, because any missteps from him in an interview like that can come back in a legal process if the fighters say sue due to CTE allegations. And if there are studies that come out later that say, yes, CTE is caused by this directly, it is a huge issue, the UFC knew about it, didn't really do anything, was paying Spencer for whatever reason. And I'm not saying that's why they were paying Spencer, but that is a question to be raised is, was that part of the deal where Dana knew his condition? Is that part of the reason they wanted to keep paying him until the sale went through? That question is raised in the article and it's a valid one, but the UFC has to be super careful and Dana has to be super careful about what they say here. You don't want to open yourself up to legal liability if you're a business by sympathizing too much with the fighters and saying something that then can be construed in a court of law as either an admission of guilt, an admission of, yes, this is on us to provide the fighters these things. He's got to walk that tightrope, regardless of what his beliefs are. Any business would, too, by the way. I think if this is not a Dana White thing, I think if Scott Coker was asked these exact same questions from a fighter that was in Strikeforce or Bellator that then was going through this, I think he would give the same types of answers. He would say it differently, obviously. I don't know that he would go in and say, yes, just like how I was an amateur boxer or amateur fighter, I experienced that stuff. I don't know that he would go that route, but he definitely walked that same tightrope of being careful not to open himself up to anything legally. And that's the continued line you're going to see out of this. I'm sure there will be more comments on this. I'm sure there will be follow-ups. I'm sure Spencer Fisher is not the last. Even Dana admitted that. And yes, unfortunately, there will be more fighters that come out of the woodwork with these issues. And if there is fighter unionization, you'd best believe there's going to be a pension and health plan that involves this. I can almost guarantee that if in terms of fighters pushing for that and wanting that. But don't expect anything else in terms of the UFC, being more vocal about this or more opening up more, whether that be, anyone in the UFC, whether that be Dana, whether that be Lawrence Epstein, whoever. This is going to be a tightly, kind of close to the chest subject in terms of what they can say because of those issues. And it's sad and it sucks. And, it just kind of is what it is in terms of what the fighters can do right now, because they don't have the leverage they need yet. If things could easily change this year, but right now, these stories, all you can do is kind of, as a fighter or a fan who is in favor of the UFC paying for this type of thing, all you can really do is just lobby the UFC to make those payments, to pressure them to say, hey, a public opinion pressure campaign of, hey, this is not cool. You need to be paying the fighters medical bills. You need to be helping them with this. You need to be doing more. That's really all that can be done at this point because there's no other leverage. So just wanted to address that because I know from a business perspective and a fan perspective, that's two very different lines. A lot of fans were saying, oh, Dana's out here talking about him and how it's affecting him. That's crazy. Why would he make it about him? And that's all. Oh, the UFC is really caring and giving all this stuff, and they are trying to make this better. In terms of their real intentions here, it's very hard to judge, because this is the type of thing that if they really wanted this to go away, they would say this. And if they really were all about fixing it, they would say this as well. They might change one or two things here and there that could kind of tip their hand a little, but this is a pretty gray response from Dana White in terms of this type of stuff. And it's typical what you'd see a brand do to protect themselves given the situation. Speaking of brands trying to distance themselves and protect themselves, you've got LFA recently saying that Pat Miletich is going to be removed from commentary this week at LFA 97 while they do an investigation in regards to Miletich's involvement in the U.S. Capitol riots that occurred not too long ago. I've seen a lot of different opinions about this. We have a video on it if you want to check out what Ant and Matt said in regards to the Pat Miletich situation. I'm going to tackle this purely from a business perspective. So I want to be upfront about that. This is going to be why a business does this and what a business sees in this type of situation. So again, when you're dealing with negative PR, which is what this is, you've got your star commentator, so to speak, because he is a UFC Hall of Famer. He is someone that's been in the business forever. You've got him in pictures at the U.S. Capitol. One quoted, I believe a quote, I think it was on Instagram. I'm not sure if it was on Instagram or Twitter, where he essentially said, I saw no violence, marching with patriots, that type of thing. And you've got him in pictures with people that are wearing things or are making signs that are, regardless of what they say, those people are saying they stand for. From the outside looking in, it certainly looks very bad in terms of what those symbols mean, right? There is the classic racist white power symbol that it appears he's in a picture with. There's some debate on whether or not that is a white power symbol, but it is the symbol that a lot of people signify with white power. There's some people wearing patches, right-wing death squad, and also there's flags in the background that there's a lot of stuff in those pictures where Pat Miletich is smiling or hanging out with people that are wearing things that you normally don't want your company associated with, right? And again, you can go into the semantics of what these things mean and where, what they actually stand for and all of that. That from a brand perspective, you see your star commentator in these pictures and you've got to do an investigation, especially because of the backlash that happened following the riots at the Capitol, right? This isn't something where, yes, you had protesters, maybe get into it with some cops here and there. It's a kind of common news story. You've got Pat Miletich standing there in some pictures doing that stuff. I'm sure they'd still launch an investigation. I've talked with Ed Soros many times, who runs the LFA, and I know a lot of the guys over at LFA. They take that stuff seriously, so I'm not saying that they would slouch on that, but I think it's a bigger deal, especially because of what happened there. And it's not that he's fired, so to speak, right? They didn't just say, nope, hey, guess what? You're fired. They said, we're doing an investigation. We're removing him from the nearest event, at LFA 97 this Friday while we do the investigation, and then we'll make a decision. That's a very prudent move on their part. Because, again, as a brand, you want to do a thorough investigation. The last thing you want to do is fire your UFC Hall of Famer commentator without really looking into it because of, a quick review and saying, okay, this is what we think. Yes, we're going to pull the trigger. And then it turns out that there's evidence hiding there. There's something you missed that makes you look foolish and maybe trigger happy in pulling Pat Miletich. That public pressure really swayed your opinion. You never want to do that, right? As a brand, you want to have core values. You want to be built on certain organizational ideals that, yes, public opinion and what your customers want are going to sway your business decisions, of course, but caving into spur of the moment public pressure never looks good, even if it ends up being right. That is a huge thing in business, is even if it ends up being the right thing to do ultimately, if it appears that you were pressured to the point where you made a trigger happy decision, even if it's the right decision, it will hurt your brand, albeit much less than if you're on the wrong side of that decision, obviously. But you never want that appearance. So them suspending him while they do an investigation, totally normal, totally right thing to do, so that they can look at all the evidence and also from a perception standpoint say that, yes, we are looking into this. We're doing the right thing by both Pat and by our fans and what we stand for. So that makes sense. Again, according to Pat Miletich's Instagram, where he shot videos discussing, him having a phone call with the LFA saying, fans don't go after the LFA for this, and that it's public pressure because there's apparently racist flags, is what he said. It's hard to say what they're really ultimately. It's going to be up to the promotion to clearly define why he was suspended and why they did the investigation and the results. Because eventually, right, their investigation is going to yield results, whether that's in, Pat staying on, whether that's in him being fired, whether that's in him being, off air in terms of an on TV personality and just being in the background in some form or fashion. They will have to give a definitive conclusion to the investigation. And when they do, they will need to specifically state why they made the choice they did. And that's another reason why doing an investigation is a great move, because it gives them time to put off that decision and put off that reasoning while things are hot right now, right? Ideally, things will cool down in the public climate. And when that happens, it'll be much easier for them to come out and say, hey, this was the decision we made, and here's the reasoning. If you do it right away, while tempers are still hot, while people are still arguing about everything, while the event just happened and everybody's still amped up from that event, you might just be adding fuel to that fire, or you might get extra backlash because that fire is burning and they see you make a decision, and all of a sudden you've got people who don't even watch the LFA or don't care about MMA seeing that this is connected to that and saying, whoa, not cool, and bombarding you and, doing classic internet troll things, which is very possible. So it's a prudent move to delay this. It's a prudent move by LFA to look into it and to give a really well thought out reason for whatever decision that they reach. Because from a business perspective, again, when something like this happens, you have to address it. Otherwise, you're essentially giving an answer without giving an answer. And you have to do it right. That even if it's, yes, I can look at it for 20 minutes and know, yep, okay, this is what's going on. This is what we need to do. If there's not, overwhelming evidence in your face, right? A video of Pat saying, things that really are not okay, then yeah, you've got to do an investigation. And mind you, they've stuck with Pat through, if you look through Pat Miletich's social media, whether it be his Instagram, whether it be his Twitter, whether you listen to his podcast. I mean, Pat has views that are not necessarily very, I mean, they're not mainstream. That's an easy way to put it. But then there are also views that might, reflect poorly on the company in some people's eyes, right? You've got him making claims about vaccines, making claims about, flat earth stuff. You've got a lot of things going on there where his views have always been out there, and LFA stuck by him through all of that. They've deemed, yeah, you know what? He can have his views, whatever, that's fine. Nothing has crossed the line for us. We love having him as a commentator. We're going to move forward with him. They have stuck by him through that. So, it's not a hair trigger decision here. And I think LFA is doing what you should do as a organization to protect your brand, which is do an investigation, come out with a well thought out answer, a well thought out decision, and go on from there. Because anything else is going to be opening yourself up to, one way or the other, people jumping on you when times are, hot, when the political and social climate is hot and tempers are flaring. If you make a quick decision, regardless, even if it's the right one, you're going to have extra backlash if you do it right away. And I know there will be criticism from some for them not immediately pulling the trigger and saying, yes, Pat, you got to go right now. That if that's ultimately where they come down, there will, or vice versa. If they say, yes, we're going to keep Pat, they're going to be those that are mad that it took an investigation and say, oh, you should have always stood by him. All that. That's still going to happen. You're going to get criticism no matter what you do. But doing it this way is the best way to protect your brand, to make sure you're making the right decision, to whatever decision that is, and to avoid the extra backlash that comes in a highly volatile political and social climate. It's not necessarily that that's going away. I'm not going to sit here and say it is, but it gives some time away from the event to render the verdict, to have, a real clear mind about everything and say, hey, this is how we feel about that situation and what Pat Miletich did. So business perspective, they're doing everything they can there in terms of protecting themselves, and that's why they're doing it. Don't be too harsh on them either way. It's what I would advise any one of my consulting clients to do in this type of situation. A staple of your brand is doing something that, it was involved in an event that ended up being a very big deal. You've got to do a thorough investigation here before you really change a key part of that broadcast, or you keep that key part of the broadcast and are able to defend that action. So yeah, good job on LFA for taking those steps. That's what you should do as a business. The next topic I want to cover here is piracy, right? Dana White has said, 2021, I got something for you guys this year on that Instagram post, that infamous Instagram post now, in terms of people talking about pirating UFC content, especially pay-per-views, given the pay-per-view price increase, which if you haven't seen that video that we did on that, go check it out, because that gives you a good idea of what's going on there. But, how much can Dana White really do? How much can the UFC do in that regard? We got a little bit more info in Dana's interview with Oscar Willis, where he said that essentially, there's always going to be piracy. So for those of you that were, thinking, oh no, here's some new information where I'm not going to be able to illegally stream the fights. And I know there's probably at least one of you out there who was a little bit worried based on those comments, thinking the UFC designed some brand new way to catch people that were pirating stuff and it's going to block it and all that. That's not the case. Even Data admitted you can't catch everyone. But he did say he was going to be more aggressive in going after some of these guys that are illegally streaming things and that are doing what, in his opinion, is stealing their content. And it's funny because if you look at what's been happening in the background, they've already been pursuing illegal streams a little bit harder and going after places like bars that have shown fights without the, proper commercial license. They've been going hard after those guys. So for illegal streams, right, you had the CARES Act, the new coronavirus relief bill that was passed. So if you got your $600, check stimulus and all that, that same bill also had in it harsher penalties for illegally streaming. Not for if you or I go on an illegal stream and we're like, oh, cool, I can watch the fights on that site that I know I can watch the fights on. Great. Not so much there as much as the people that are hosting that site, that are putting the original stream on that site that we then go to and visit. Those people, it really ups the penalties for them. That's, you had one site, which I won't name because I know I'll get flack for it forever. And that was a pretty popular illegal streaming site that was shut down ahead of this. Preemptively, they shut themselves down. They said, nope, we're not getting involved with this because we think it's going to pass. We think, in the US, this bill is going to pass. Obviously, it's tied to all this coronavirus relief. It's now part of that bill and wrapped up into that bill. We're going to go ahead and shut down preemptively. Probably a smart call on their end. I would do the same if I was in that boat because some of these things, again, are felonies now. So you've got to be careful if you're illegally hosting this stuff. It's kind of a much harsher penalty and a much bigger deal than it used to be. In terms of before, you had misdemeanors. Yes, you could be sued in civil court, all of that. But this is technically jail time. That's pretty harsh. I believe it's 10 years. Don't quote me on that. You can look it up. It was, a big part of the bill and making the rounds on social media for a while. Much harsher penalties for hosting illegal streams, especially if you're hosting an illegal stream and then getting some type of easily tracked monetary profit, whether that be advertising on an illegal site or if you're hosting somewhere where you're paying people to watch. Same type of deal. So there is a harsher crackdown here. And Dana, again, has said he's going to go after people more aggressively. But I'm getting this from combatsportslaw.com, which, if you haven't been to that site, great site, very informative stuff in terms of really lawsuits and things, legal things that are going on in the background with the UFC. So January 8th, story right there by Eric McCragen. And I'm sorry, Eric, if I'm mispronouncing your name. You probably want to follow him on Twitter if you're not already, because he's up there in terms of having that knowledge and information of all the legal things going on, combat sports related, especially around Canada. Great source of information. But so this story, dated January 8th, 2021, $90,000 in damages awarded for copyright infringement after pay-per-view piracy. And it talks about Johan Promotions Incorporated, which, if you don't know who they are, they're the intermediary between the UFC and places like Buffalo Wild Wings or different bars. That's who bars go through in terms of getting a UFC pay-per-view shown legally at their bar, right? They have to pay a certain fee. Depends on your capacity, how many people are there. Lots of different things go into that calculation, but it can end up being quite a hefty fee to stream those pay-per-views. And so they go through Johan Promotions, Inc. In this case, it's Johan Promotions, Inc. versus DuPont, which is a restaurant which the plaintiff, who contractually secured commercial licensing rights for various combat sports, sued various defendants for displaying pay-per-view without purchasing the commercial sub-licensing agreement. And while some parties settled, others failed to respond, and so they get default judgment, and they got copyright damages. Now, this is a new thing. So normally you have damages like libel damages, again, for, breach of trust, all these lots of different things. But copyright infringement is a new piece of the piracy puzzle, because if you can go after copyright, especially for US cases, that is and it's really now violations of the Communications Act, but also the Copyright Infringement and Copyright Act, also the Copyright Act. That adds on those damages. That can make those damages much steeper. $90,000 is a lot of money for some restaurant because they didn't show the UFC pay-per-view legally. And you were always going to get damages for other things as well. But I mean, adding in copyright infringement there really just compounds those damages and allows the UFC to go after these guys even harder than before. Because maybe you have, a particularly wealthy restaurant that does well and maybe has 2 or 3 places, right? Trying to think off the top of my head where, you have a restaurant with maybe 2 or 3 locations. They're not national, but maybe they're regional, or they're in a particular city. They've got enough money and they do this, and oh no, they've been caught for illegally streaming the UFC pay-per-view, and here comes the summary judgment. Let's say it's 20, 30 grand. That's still a huge hit to them. Don't get me wrong, but maybe they can weather that. Maybe they can say, yes, this was a terrible mistake. We fired everybody. We've settled all that stuff, 20, 30 grand. 90 now, tripling that, that's a lot. That's a big deal. And it also affects settlements. Whereas before, maybe you could settle down and get it under, 10 grand or maybe a little over 10 grand. Yeah, we'll pay you double what we were going to pay you in terms of the commercial sub-license because we did this. Okay, UFC might have been willing to settle that when you take into account all the lawyers' fees and court costs and all of that, right? Because obviously, if the UFC isn't making a profit going after these guys and at least recouping some of the money they lost by them illegally showing it, it's not worth it. This gives the UFC much more incentive to pursue legal action because the damages getting near 6 figures, or I'm sure in some cases could reach 6 figures, that's something that is worth paying the court fees and the lawyer, so many hours for, because you're going to make money on that. So it's a big deal. And they've been going after people in the background here for a while. Again, combatsportslaw.com has plenty of examples of the UFC and Zuffa going after particular restaurants or people that were trying to stream the pay-per-view fights illegally. It makes sense to do so. And again, if the Copyright Act and copyright infringement is a part of those violations, could certainly be argued it could be part of someone illegally streaming a pay-per-view on the internet on some of these illegal sites that a lot of people like to watch fights on. Because I certainly understand, the constant cost of buying pay-per-views, right? If you buy every pay-per-view now, it's up to $70 per pay-per-view moving forward. So let's say that's the case this year, and you buy every single pay-per-view, paying $5 just to access ESPN. So that's $60 right there. Let's say you get a discount on that because you buy it in years. Let's say you can get it knocked down to $50 in some way, that it's $50 just for the yearly ESPN Plus subscription fee. Then you've got $70 per pay-per-view. So $70 times 12, that right there is $800 or $8,400. Is that right? No, $840. My bad. I was going to say that's way too much. Take 1 0 off there. $840 a year plus the $50 you're already spending. That's nearly $1,000 a year on UFC pay-per-views, right? That's $890 a year if you're buying every single pay-per-view and I'm averaging once a month. That's nuts. And you may get, an extra pay-per-view in there, right? We've seen that happen before where you have a month with 2 pay-per-views. So it might be much closer to $1,000 a year. It could be $960. That's a lot of money for the average citizen, especially in a pandemic where COVID has wreaked havoc on, jobs of all sorts of people. It is hard to say that, it's easy to afford a purely legal method of watching the UFC. Take into account countries that are much more locked down in the US too, right? Where you can't go to a bar. At least in the US, you're gonna find a couple bars that are showing the fights. Probably, if you're in bigger cities. But in some of these more lockdown countries, you can't go to a bar to go do this. And yes, there are different, depending on the country you're in, pay-per-view costs are going to be lower. In some cases, they might even be free. There's a whole yes, but let's assume again, you're in a place in the US where you can't go out to a bar to watch the fights because of the coronavirus lockdown. And maybe you've lost your job or you've had to take a pay cut or anything else because of the pandemic. Asking those fans to pay $890 in a year just to access fights is rough. And so you can imagine that's going to affect pay-per-view buys in some way. But the UFC is going to be more alert than ever about piracy because of that. Because they expect in these conditions, when things aren't necessarily great economically for Main Street, so to speak. Wall Street, yeah, that's a different, that's a whole different ballgame. But again, if you're talking about Wall Street money, then paying for every UFC pay-per-view isn't that bad. But for the blue collar Main Street guys, especially that love watching fights, that's a lot of money. And it's a dire time financially and economically to ask them to pay that money. So the UFC will be heightened in looking for ways to shut down these sites, will be more aggressive. That's what Dana's saying in not so many words, is expect the promotion to be more aggressive in pursuing people that host the streams. Don't have to worry as much if you've found one of these sites and you see a live stream and you decide to watch, right? It doesn't make financial sense for the UFC to go after everybody that does that. They're not going to do that. But if the host can be taken, right? The guy that puts up the original stream, that makes all the other viewers see a blank black screen, if they get taken down, then you're at a position where it really cuts down on piracy and it forces people's hand. Because the harder and more you restrict access to these illegal streams, it will lead some people to say, whatever, I'll catch the highlights or I'll see if I can find a legal stream to watch the replay or what have you. But it will lead other people to say, man, I really want to see Conor McGregor fight Dustin Poirier. I don't care if I have to spend $70. I'm going to look for a legal stream. Oh, man, my favorite one was taken down. I can't do it. All right, I'm going to fork over the money. And that's the game. That's what the UFC is doing to combat piracy. It's not going away. It's not going to be, oh, you can't illegally watch things. No, that there will be methods. I'm sure they'll still be out there. You can't get rid of them all, but expect a harsher crackdown and expect the UFC to be much more aggressive in going after people for real life-altering damages, not just pay me double, pay me triple what you were going to anyway, but okay, this is going to bankrupt your restaurant if you do this, or this is going to put you in a lot of debt if you're an individual who's decided to do this. So that's what those piracy comments are about. Next thing I want to cover here is the responses that were filed to the UFC antitrust lawsuit recently. So for those of you that missed last week or haven't heard, Judge Boulware, who is presiding over the UFC antitrust lawsuit right now in terms of class certification, recently made it known through an order that he planned to unseal all the documents involved in the antitrust lawsuit hearings. This would be massive. This was a huge part of my episode last week. If you haven't checked that out, definitely go and rewatch that one because it's got some important information. One of my more important episodes to kick off the new year. But essentially, Judge Boulware said you have until January 11th to file any motions or file any objections or anything in terms of me unsealing these documents, making them unredacted so we can read the whole thing, which would be a huge deal. There are a lot of business documents in these hearings that would give us some great insight to not only what the UFC has been doing in the past and how they kind of created the organization and this massive, conglomerate that they've made, but it would also give us insight into Bellator, into Strikeforce, Pride, and Bellator has essentially filed an objection stating that there are pieces of evidence that were submitted by Bellator that would show future and current methods of doing business and how they are making profit right now. That's what the objection comes down to. Of course, it's in legalese. You can see it if you want. If you go to courtlistener.com and search Lee, so lev.zuffa LLC, should show up in terms of that's a free website that allows you to check out any filings that have been made on a case, and you can go ahead and buy certain things through Pacer, but you have to have a Pacer system, which is what lawyers use. That's a whole nother thing. But this objection is, you can view that PDF for free, and it in legalese essentially states, we gave this information, Bellator gave this information to the parties involved in the lawsuit and at the discretion of the judge at the time, under the assumption that none of this was going to become public. That, we gave a lot of our crucial financial data and business model that we are still using today, all under the assumption that no one was going to see this except the parties that needed to, and it was going to be sealed, redacted, and really only privy to those that absolutely needed to look at this information. So they filed an objection. The UFC, of course, filed an objection saying, hey, we don't care for this. Along with that, we've had several media members, including John Nash, who, again, one of the originals, who's been following this forever and written a million great things, a bloody elbow, in terms of this stuff, saying, hey, we feel, as a journalist and bloody elbow, we feel that these should be unsealed. You've had Stephen Morocco from MMA Fighting, who I mentioned earlier, also voices support. You've had the New York Times file a plea to the judge saying these should be unsealed. There's no precedent for it. The New York Times filing actually has a lot of legalese in it itself to kind of try and sway the judge through legal precedents of why this information should be made public and be redacted so that everyone can see it. And this highlights, again, another key, really one of the most crucial points in the case. This is more crucial, in my opinion, than the class action certification. And here's why. The class action certification was needed for the lawsuit to move forward. Yes, you had to have that in order for it to move forward. So at its heart, it's one of the most important things that happened regarding the UFC lawsuit. But these documents unveiling Bellator's not only previous business model, but current business model, looking at what the UFC did to build their company, to see some of these special fighter contracts like Brock Lesnar, to get a look at these letters of agreement, which are side letters in terms of, yes, there's disclosed pay here, but some of these fighters had letters of agreement on the side that required certain things. Rampage Jackson was, you got to get me a Dodge Challenger. I think it's either a Charger or a Challenger, and you have to, go out and procure it this particular way, which ends up, making some of the numbers fighters were making that we saw as media and as fans, where you'd say, man, I can't believe you only got paid that much. Well, it turns out that there is some truth to these stories about, there's locker room bonuses. Yes, there's generosity that Dana White gives out more than a lot of people say. They don't really have any clue there. And yes, there are perks to being a top-ranked contender or a champion that go beyond the normal, disclosed show and win money and pay-per-view points that we know about. Here are some of those extra requests, like a Dodge Charger. I'm going to go with Charger now for Rampage checks. So this would be huge because it would finally pull back the curtain once and for all for how the UFC grew and got its business to a place where then it was bought out for $4 billion by Endeavor. How it amassed that wealth, how it really, the inner workings of that business, as well as current inner workings for Bellator. And my guess would be that the information that we would learn on the UFC side would also be applicable to today. Not all of it, obviously, but I'm sure a fair amount of it would. And that would have more ramifications in the greater scope of the industry and for competitors and business and the MMA industry in general. That would have greater ramifications than the UFC antitrust lawsuit getting class certified, in my opinion. Because, again, that could shake up the entire industry. If I'm Bellator and I'm struggling to fit a couple of pieces together so I can really start to ramp up revenue and compete with the UFC, and I have to fumble around and figure out myself, and then someone unseals and reveals exactly how the UFC did what they did, I can either replicate it, I can try and block them because, turns out they're getting a bunch of revenue from a channel that I hadn't even thought about or that I thought was small. Turns out that's not the case. Maybe then I try and get into there and grow my presence in that channel so that I can take away their money as well as feeding me. It opens up a lot of possibilities. I don't think that if you unseal these documents and we learn all of this stuff, it's going to be something that Bellator or ONE or PFL can just take and plug in and say, yep, cool, now we're real competitors with the UFC. No, there's no chance of that happening. But to Bellator's point, there might be a way for the PFL or ONE Championship to plug in some of Bellator's things and methods and tactics quickly and maybe start competing on that level, right? As I mentioned before, PFL and ONE Championship are at that startup phase level. They're losing money through their operations and they're getting their funding through investors and through series funding, saying, yes, hey, we need some more money. Here's the idea. Here's when we'll be profitable. Invest with us. Help us get there. And then as we grow profitable, it's like buying Facebook at $2 a share. That's the pitch. If they can look at Bellator's practices and streamline some of their inefficiencies, bolster their processes in ways where they can, cut some costs or make extra revenue, increase their bottom line, that's huge. Because then PFL and ONE Championship stay alive longer, right? We've seen MMA promotions, for those of you who've been around for a long time, we've seen MMA promotions come and go. We've seen them try at the height of MMA popularity. We've seen them try different formats, try new things, run for a couple of years and run out of money or shut down. Right? Elite or exit. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm brain fart today. You know what I'm talking about. Elite FC. Elite XFC, where Kimbo was at. And yes, you can roast me in the comments for that. By all means, roast me in the comments for that. It's been a long day, but you get my point. We've seen these promotions come and go. If PFL or ONE Championship can give anything, can get any sort of advantage from these documents to keep their doors open longer, that's massive. Because that keeps increased competition. That keeps them in business. And there's a real possibility there will be certain things in these documents that the PFL or ONE Championship or some of these smaller promotions could look at and say, oh, I could try doing that too. And it might really make a difference. So it's big. It's a big deal because it affects the entire industry if these get unsealed. Now, I'm watching every day to see when the judge will make his decision. Again, he is slow on this stuff, so don't expect this to happen tomorrow. When it does, though, if it happens to coincide with the regular episode, again, I will make sure to cover that pretty much the entire episode. If it doesn't, I will do a special episode on what I find in these unsealed documents, if he unseals them. Right now, it certainly seems like he's going to unseal them based on, the indications he's given, unless, the objections filed by the UFC and Bellator have swayed him to some amount. I think we do get these documents unsealed and unredacted. And it's also possible these documents have nada. and it wouldn't be nada, so to speak, but it's possible that, I'm overhyping this. I really think there's good information in there, but there's also the possibility I am wrong. And there's a couple of interesting tidbits here and there, but nothing that's really applicable to today because, again, 2010, 2016, the world's changed a lot in the past 5 years, right? I mean, we've had a global pandemic. We've had a lot of restructuring and inward infrastructure changes for businesses as they've gone remote and as they've adopted, this COVID world. It's possible some of this stuff won't be applicable. But my guess is there will be things in there worthwhile, and it could be a game changer. So be on the lookout for that. And again, we'll see where it goes. All right, real quickly to wrap up this episode, I'm going to do my UFC 257 pay-per-view buy predictions. Now, this one is a little different than the other pay-per-view buy predictions I've done because Conor McGregor was kind enough to show us how much he made from UFC 246. It's Donald Cerrone. He put out on social media the actual invoice McGregor Entertainment got. So those are legit numbers. It's 1.3 something, 1.316. I forget the exact pinpoint number. You can find it out there if you want on Conor's Twitter. I'm not sure if it's on Instagram or not, but 1.3 million is basically what it ended up as in terms of actual pay-per-view buys. So using that as a reference point and looking at him versus Dustin, a couple things that come into play here. UFC 246 was pre-COVID, right? Seems like forever ago, but it was a year ago. And in January of last year, COVID wasn't a thing. It just wasn't a pandemic yet. And people could attend events and go out places and do things. We've seen through COVID, again, whether the numbers are inflated a lot, inflated a little, whether they're accurate, we've seen a trend of higher pay-per-view buy rates post-COVID, which makes sense, especially internationally in countries where they have stricter lockdowns, but you still have to buy pay-per-views for the UFC. We've seen a huge jump because you can't go to your friend's house where one person, buys the pay-per-view, 10 of you get together, sit down and watch. It's not a thing in other countries, especially where they've imposed strict lockdowns. And we've also seen that countries that had kind of come out of those lockdowns are now going back into those lockdowns from the Christmas and New Year's surge, right? You had some relaxation on restrictions in many places as cases had gone down. And now that we're seeing this big second wave, especially with colder weather in other places, that also is conducive to the spread of COVID. You've got this big jump in cases and this big change where a lot of these countries now are going back to lockdowns where you can't go out to bars. You can't really leave your house to go hang out with other people. It's not a thing. So I think international buys are going to be up just naturally from that. I don't think Dustin is the same draw Cerrone is, in the sense that Cerrone has done more mainstream things, right? He's had a couple of TV show appearances. He's done some commercials. He's a hardcore guy, but even the casual fans kind of say, oh, yeah, Donald Cerrone, cowboy, right? Where's cowboy hat? Yeah. Even the casuals and semi-casuals are probably going to know who Cerrone is. Dustin Poirier, not so much. He's been in some big profile fights. He's amongst the hardcores. We all know and love him, but he hasn't really gotten that crossover exposure. And yes, semi-casuals, people that have watched Khabib fight him or, watched Conor's run up to, getting that first title. And if they've gone back and rewatched Conor fights, all that, yeah, they'll know who he is, but he's not going to be much of a draw on his own in this, I think. Still, given the current COVID climate, given Conor McGregor is still Conor McGregor and is bound to pull in numbers, I'm going to go 1.7 million here. I think you get a healthy boost from the international buys due to the harsher lockdowns. I think even in the States, in some areas where we've seen big spikes, right, which has been a lot of parts of the country, I think people are going to be more wary, and you're going to have fight fans that say, you know what, maybe I could go to a bar, But given a huge increase in cases, I'm just going to go ahead and buy it at home. And maybe they'll watch it with friends and buy it at home there, but that's still probably a couple extra buys in certain areas. I think regardless, Conor is still a draw and will easily do over $1 million, even behind the ESPN Plus wall, even with the price increase. I know that's a big one, right? A lot of people are saying, oh, I don't know, an extra $5, I don't know. Yeah, but it's a Conor fight. I think there will be a lot of people that buy this pay-per-view and don't buy most any other pay-per-view. Even among hardcore MMA fans, I can see a lot saying, you know what, I'm going to actually buy the Conor one, and then maybe I'll illegally stream if I can find those streams for some of the lesser known ones that may come out during the year. But for the Conor one, I want to make sure I have a good stream. I want to make sure I don't miss anything. Nothing cuts out. I want good quality. I want to be right in there with the action. I'm going to buy it. I'm going to drop my $70 for this one. I can see that happening. I really can. And it is a big pay-per-view. Has big ramifications in the lightweight title picture. We'll see what happens with Khabib, but if he doesn't come back, winner of this one is almost certainly in a fight for the vacant championship, if not promoted to lightweight champion when it's all said and done. So I think you're looking at 1.7 million buys here. Let me know in the comments if you think I'm right on that. Let me know your predictions, because I have been wrong before. I know, shocking, but occasionally I've gotten a couple things wrong here and there. But I'm thinking a healthy 1.7 million. Not going to break the 2 million mark. Going to be more than Cowboy just because of the environment right now. 1.7 million is what I'm saying as of right now. All right, guys, well, that wraps up the Fight Business Podcast for this week. If you're watching on YouTube and you haven't hit the like or subscribe button, please do. Also hit that notification button so you can know when we drop new videos. We are going big in 2021 at the Body Lock. So hopefully you guys are going to love what we're doing and give us feedback, because it's going to be a big year for us. If you're listening via Spotify, Apple Podcast, Anchor, FM, what have you, again, I really appreciate it. Feel free to hit me up with any questions on Twitter at AllDayOJ, on Instagram at AllDayOJ as well, though I'm not as frequent on there. Twitter's more likely where you're going to catch my eye. And let me know what your favorite segments are here. If you have any feedback about the podcast, I love hearing feedback. I love trying to improve this, to talk about things that you guys want to talk about more on the business side. And yeah, with that in mind, stay safe, stay healthy, and get this money.